Welcome to What is Community Planning. I'm Liz Harris. I work for BikeWalkKC, and my pronouns are she, her. We welcome you to today's panel presentation. We are delighted to have Tresa Carter, our own community planner, Director of Community Planning here at BikeWalkKC, and we welcome our panelists, Triveece and Sara and Jenna. We're happy to have you all here today. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And I am going to welcome Tresa Carter, who is the Director of Community Planning here at BikeWalkKC, to the stage. She is going to introduce our panelists today, and she's going to host our conversation. Thank you all for coming. We are delighted that you're here. Tresa, all yours.
Okay. Well, sincerely, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. We really appreciate everyone spending their lunch hour with us, especially being yet again in a virtual space. And we're especially grateful to our panelists for sharing all of their knowledge today with us, their perspectives, and their unique experiences. So as Liz said, I'm Tresa. I am the community planner here at BikeWalkKC. And since joining here in the winter of 21, I've been working really closely with other staff to set priorities for our planning program. And we decided that this was a great year, being post-pandemic, hopefully, and with a new planner on board to really better define what community planning means. So at its core, BikeWalkKC aims to empower both individuals and communities to take action on their own behalf. And the primary way that we do this is through education. So as an organization, we already have a lot of courses that we offer about confident city cycling, how you can maintain your bike, walk safe to school, and how to advocate for better policies. And now what we really want to start a conversation about is what community planning is, why it matters, and how it relates to the way every single person on this call lives out their lives. So ultimately, and this might sound funny to a lot of people, especially people in the consulting space, but BikeWalkKC will have met its mission when we actually are no longer needed as an organization. So when we have a strong network of advocates and community planning champions, and all kinds of people feeling safe and confident to ride their bikes, walk, and use public transit, then genuinely our purpose will be fulfilled. And so doing a program like this is a really important part for us to meet that mission. So with that stage set, we invited these 3 community planners who are based out of the Kansas City area to share their reflections on what community planning as a practice is, what it means to each of them to be a planner, and also to give some advice to everyone in this call today about how you can use your voice to have an impact in your own neighborhood. So joining us today, if you want to just give a little wave, we've got Jenna Fernandez. She is an urban planner at Landwork Studio. We have Triveece Penelton. She's a city planner and public involvement innovator at Vireo. And Sara Copeland. She's a senior transportation planner at Burns and McDonnell. So we really want to focus our time today learning from our panelists. So we made sure that their bios and their contact information are online if you'd like to read more. So Liz or Amy are going to send a link to where you can find that in the chat, so you'll be able to have access to that. And really, we want to make this interactive. So our panelists, they know that they can ignore me and engage directly with one another if somebody says something interesting, or they might even want to respectfully challenge something that the other person has said. And every panelist might not answer every question. It just depends on who wants to share. So we really want to make this organic and authentic and just meaningful for everybody on the call today. So Liz already mentioned this, but we were very intentional in trying to create questions that were based on what everybody here indicated that they really wanted to hear about. But if you have questions that jump into your minds as you hear someone say something, post them in the chat. Liz or Amy, they'll sprinkle those in throughout, or we might save them at the end, just kind of depending on how the conversation is going. Okay. So with that, we are just going to dive right in. I think this hour is going to go really fast. So in your own words, what is community planning and what does it mean to you? I won't call on anyone if someone wants to just jump right in, or maybe I will. Go ahead, Sara.
I'll jump in. I think community planning is convening a community to have a discussion and to set a course for some kind of project or for the community at large. And that's a pretty general definition that can be applied in lots of different ways. Sometimes when we convene a community, we have a particular project in mind and we need to make decisions about something that's being built or implemented pretty quickly. Sometimes when we bring a community together, it's a smaller group of people. Sometimes though, we want to bring everyone to the table because we're setting a long-term course for the entire community. And we're setting a course for the future that we might not achieve for 20 or 30 years. So planning is really interesting to me as a professional because there are so many different ways to be a planner and ways to interact with the process and types of processes. So it's a field that, you get planners like me and Jenna and Triveece who are working on wildly different kinds of projects. You get people who specialize in one particular part of a community, like maybe someone specializes in stormwater planning. Not my field, but people do that. Or you get people who are more generalists, which is, I've been more of a generalist throughout my career. So sometimes it's hard to say what is community planning just because it can mean so many different things and be applied in so many different ways. The thing that I like about it and that's, makes me passionate is I think fundamentally community planning is about coming together collectively to dream about what is possible and then to try to figure out how we can all work together to make those dreams reality. And that's why I go to work every morning.
I didn't know if Triveece wanted to say anything, but I wanted to, kind of branch off of that. I think planning is such a broad spectrum of things that you could do as, a planner. And I think of it as every single facet of a community is live, work, play, shop, and get around. That's kind of my generalization of planning. And all of those, you can think of each one of those things as housing, economic development, parks and recreation, transportation, and all those policies that go with those things. And all of those different things, you can think of those as maybe threads that make up like the urban fabric or the tapestry that make up each of our communities. And planners are really the people that help guide the way that tapestry or the fabric is made. Like we're telling the architects, we're telling the engineers where to put things, how they're supposed to look. And we're really doing that based off of each individual community and city that we're working in. So, we're obviously building off of planners' plans that already exist. There's a history of planners over time, and each one of us now are just building off of that and building off of that. So we're all kind of contributing to this community and city space that we are helping guide based on what the community wants.
I would add this to that, which is when people would ask me what planning is, I used to tell them that it's how communities are going to grow and change over a period of time. And then someone said to me, "Oh my gosh, you say it that way." And I said, "Yes, that's how I describe it." And then over time, I started changing it, some of it, and I would describe it more in terms of what we do. So I usually say things like, how you have your house in your neighborhood and there are other homes in that neighborhood with you and there are places to shop and things like that. I say, well, planners decide and work with community members to figure out where the housing is going to go. Most of us live in urbanized communities already. So they're communities that already have homes, they already have neighborhoods or homeowners associations, they have places to shop, et cetera. And so planners figure out where those additional homes are going to go. If homes in the neighborhood need assistance, we figure out how rehab is going to happen for those homes. We figure out where the shops are going to go. If you're doing long-range planning documents, you might start working with the school district to figure out what population growth is anticipated in your community and how that relates to the needs that you need from an educational standpoint. So you're talking about more families coming into your community. We look at where the industrial uses should be or where the employment centers should be. We look at how those are accessed. And then we also start looking at what the land can actually sustain or hold, because you can do certain analyses that will tell you that this land is probably better for agriculture or it's better for housing than it is for maybe commercial and shopping and industrial. And so we look at where the placement of all those things are going to go. And when we're doing that, we do look at a lot of data. There's census data out there. There's data on what's happening to the land. There's transportation data and so on. And just like Jenna and Sarah said, you can also specialize as in terms of what you do for your work. Often what people encounter are transportation planners, because we have a lot of roadway projects happening in Kansas City. There were transportation planners and then civil engineers, traffic specialists that worked on our transportation network here in Kansas City. And so we start to look at that. And where you see things pulling together or coming together is often our transportation routes. And then you look at what the uses are adjacent to that. Those uses are often called land uses. So when I say residential, commercial, retail, school, education, those are land use types. And so where development, which is broadly describing land use, where that happens is often related to your transportation routes. Where you don't develop has something to do often with what the capacity of that land is, or something you're trying to preserve from an environmental standpoint. There's a big difference between an area that's already developed and how much you can influence or affect change there. And so that's why here in Kansas City, you see a lot of urban areas and we start talking about where bike lanes should go or not, or where transit routes should go or not. And it has a lot to do with what we already have in terms of development. You can also do work in other areas that aren't developed. And so I've done that type of work too. And I'm sure Sarah and Jenna have been in other places. We've all been places besides Kansas City in general, at least seen them, right? And so it's a little bit more interesting because you don't have as many constraints. You can really actually start to design a community in certain respects, where the future uses should be, how people are going to access them. And you also start looking at what types of services are available. There's one thing to say, a service is a grocery store. If you ask people what the number one service that they want in their neighborhood is, usually what you find is it's grocery, right? Because we want to be able to get food. We want to cook for our families. We want to do those things. But you also need something else, which is you need to be able to flush the toilet and it work. And that's sewer. You need to have sewer. You need to have water. And when you start thinking about areas that are undeveloped and are trying to plan for new development, having utility access begins to be a big component of people's thinking. And I know that from working in maybe some more rural communities where we're planning the future and we're looking at land uses, and everybody out there is pretty much the kind of farmers. When I say kind of farmers, I mean they have big, humongous pastures, but maybe they're not raising cattle and corn and things like that, but they would consider themselves a farmer. And they start wondering, well, okay, how are you going to handle this waste? Having sewer lines is a big component of growth. And so when I was saying before, community planning has a lot to do with, or could be described as how communities grow and change. Sometimes people don't want to grow, and they know that growth has certain things that make that happen. Sewer is a component of that. Political will is a component of that. Political will, what am I talking about? Your elected officials being interested in seeing development happen in certain places. So there's a lot of factors in planning. I think it's a great opportunity for people to be able to focus on a particular topic, but also see how it relates to other things. That's why I was talking to you about land use and transportation. Then I started to fold in something about utilities. Some planners really do focus on the transportation side. I am what you would probably call a land use planner. I'm more in that general space. I tend to work with people who are experts in their field, and then I generally have a high level knowledge of a lot of things. And then I have an opportunity to have great partners to work with. And that collaborative spirit is important because planners, we have expertise. We go to school. A lot of us have master's degrees in planning. There are people that have doctorates in planning. There are people that have bachelor's degrees in planning, I think. But you don't know everything because you don't work in every community. You don't work in every neighborhood, even if you're from that particular city, because you can't be everywhere at all times. And so something that planning is for me is the opportunity to think about how I can use the skill sets that I have as a person to help communities be where they want to be. And so it's an opportunity to help community members have the impact that they want to have in their community. As a consultant, it means that I'm there for a period of time because I'm on contract to be there for a certain period of time. I probably had to compete to be in that community for a certain period of time because that's what consulting is. I started my career on the government side. I used to be the planner for Kansas City's urban core way back in the day. And in that respect, because of my background and because I went to the University of Kansas, which is a policy-oriented school, there was a lot about serving the community. And so if you were working for the city of Kansas City, Missouri, you did need to live somewhere within the boundaries of the city. And I think that's so that you can have a closer feel to the community. And then it does feel like you're serving more. I feel like I'm doing that now, but it's just, I'm not doing it sort of in perpetuity. I'm doing it for a period of time and working on a project and doing my best to make it so that we are listening to what's important to people. And so I think listening is also part of community planning.
Yeah. So all of you just touched in different ways, I think, on something that is at the very core of what mystifies people about planning. And that is that it is so broad. I think each of you used the word kind of general at some point in your descriptions of how you would describe it. So how do we make planning feel relevant to an individual person? To the people on this call today, many of whom said that they don't have any prior knowledge of what planning means. How would you kind of break that down to make community planning, especially when we think about things like comprehensive plans, which sometimes have 20-year timelines? It's like, well, why should I care about that? How does that affect me? Why is planning personal? So how would you, I'd be interested to see how some of you might try to make that personal for people.
Well, I would say that everyone joining us today, if you think about your neighborhood where you live, even if you really love your neighborhood, I would assume that there's something that you think could be better about it. I live in Waldo. I like Waldo a lot. Waldo does not have the best sidewalks. I think that there are a lot of places where there are just no sidewalks. Waldo could be, I'm sure I could come up with more things, but there's got to be something about your neighborhood that you think could be better. Or somewhere nearby, maybe where you work. I'm sure you can think of at least one thing that could be better. So comprehensive plans, even when you're talking about a 20-year time horizon, you start with some kind of action immediately. There's something that is in that plan that a community is going to start with for in the first year after it's adopted, and they're going to pick some actions or some capital projects or something, and they're going to start work on implementing the plan, working through projects, making policy changes. There are actions that are going to happen. So even if the things you want to change about a place are going to take a long time, you start somewhere. And even if the thing that's important to you is not the first item on the list, eventually the hope is that your community gets to your priority. Or, in a few years, they're going to say, oh, we're finally ready to work on sidewalks. Let's go back to the plan and see what we agreed we needed to do, what actions we needed to take. If it's a capital project, it's a policy change, something. So you have to get, if there's something you care about your community, whether it's something you want to preserve or something you want to change, you have to be part of that conversation to get the things you want on the list or in the plan, so that you have set the stage for those changes to be made. It is hard sometimes to see how it all comes together. I agree with Triveece. That's part of the job of the planner, is to really understand how everything relates, or to go back to Jenna's metaphor, how all of these disparate threads contribute to an overall urban fabric. You know, because sometimes it's hard to see that, but planning is where it all starts, by getting our priorities organized and understanding how they all relate to each other.
Definitely. It is super complex, and I know it could be sometimes hard to understand, but you know, all of the communities that we choose to live in, neighborhood, city, whatever, like these spaces are meant for us to enjoy. And, you know, our job as planners is to really reach out to the community if we don't live there, even other cities, different communities, different neighborhoods, and ask you what you want to see, what would make your life better. And I think, you know, all of us, we do our best in some way to try to make our lives better, our communities better, because we care about where we live, where we decide to live. So, you know, I work a lot in parks and recreation planning. So I work in public spaces and really trying to reach out to communities in that way. And these are really civic spaces for us to get together, share ideas, and have all of our needs met. I think a good way of describing what a planner is that we're a general problem solver as a person. So any problem you have, any vision you have, like, we're in your corner to help you achieve those things, and dream as big as you want, because sky's the limit. So
I think that's really important.
Idea.
The idea, like what you said, Jenna, about dreaming, because one of the things about planning is that you want to do visioning, and you want, so basically, where are we trying to go? What kind of anchors do we want to put on that kind of thing, guiding principles, etc. And sometimes when you're dreaming, somebody will say, well, no, the dream is too big. How are we going to pay for that? And what I always say is that, well, let's not kill the dream before we can fully have the dream. Let's see where you want to go. And then most things can be broken down. They can even be broken down into what my favorite phrase is for the last couple of years is micro phases, because some things take so long and they're so big, and it's just like one element of things. And I think because planning tackles those larger projects and smaller projects, sometimes the variety is so large that it's hard to identify what planning is and where we're supposed to be starting with it. So when Sarah was talking about find something that you maybe just focus on a thing that you want to improve, I think that's really important. Here in Kansas City, the comprehensive plan is going on. So we've been having a lot of conversations about livability. So what do you need to make your life go well at the neighborhood level? We've been talking about serviceability, which is the ability to provide services. And at that point, you're talking about networks of things. So when I was talking about sewer and water, we know that there are pipes underground that come out of our house and connect to a larger system. That's service. Well, in those conversations, there have been a lot of Kansas Cityans talking about neighborhoods and what they need for their particular neighborhood. And I think that thinking about the neighborhood level starts to make things a little more accessible to people. So what do you need in your particular neighborhood? I'm working on something with the city right now. It's sidewalks. And we had someone who's from Southern Kansas City, and she's close to Martin City. And she is in a neighborhood that doesn't have sidewalks. And she was really fed up about not having sidewalks. The city, if you don't know, is going through a whole process to inspect the sidewalks. And you can see online right now where they have inspected. And they will inspect the whole entire city. But right now they've done a portion of it. And they have different amounts of feedback that they've gotten over that whole course. Well, what I thought was really great in one of our public meetings is the person that was talking about we don't have sidewalks and just feeling fed up and neglected by the city, now the establishment of Kansas City, Missouri, and how things happen there. She was encouraged by a neighborhood leader. The neighborhood leader had went through different city processes to get sidewalks installed in her neighborhood. And she had said to her, do you have a neighborhood association? She said, we started our neighborhood association, and forgive me, I just can't think of the name of the neighborhood association right now. But she said, we started ours because we had a need. We had something that we needed to get fixed and get done in our community. So we organized so that we could start to get that. And that's you beginning to try to tackle an issue, but then not doing it alone. You're doing it with a group of people. And that's important because you want to be able to speak with one voice about what you need. And then you can begin to look at, well, how does that relate to other plans or other projects that might be or may not be happening in our neighborhood? And I know there's been a lot of talk about what we can do at the neighborhood level, how that's funded, and all of those things make the planning work become more accessible to people because they can identify what they want in their neighborhood or what they need and begin to make the efforts to make that happen. And that is planning.
And I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind if you are not a planner is that you don't have to know the solution to the problem, right? If you love your neighborhood, but there's something that bothers you, you don't have to know how to fix it. That's kind of the role of the planners to help figure out, okay, how do we address this problem? What's the next step? Who else do we need to talk to figure out how to address that thing that bothers you? So once you've gotten your neighborhood together and you've organized yourselves and you understand your priorities, then that's where planners then can come in and help you figure out what's the to-do list and the next steps, and how do you get from point A to point B.
And I think Sarah's bringing up and Triveece neighborhood associations because I think to us, those are the first groups of people that we sometimes reach out to because they are spokespeople for these smaller communities within Kansas City, for example, as a whole. So a lot of times if you really want an issue taken care of or want to get in touch with somebody, a planner, somebody who could help you with that, typically going to your neighborhood association is a good first step because those people are registered with the city, they're recognized, and a lot of community planners here already know a lot of the neighborhood associations. So it's a great first step to talk to somebody about improvements or issues you might be having in your personal neighborhood or community.
Well, and there are resources that can help you with that. So I'm on UMKC Center for Neighborhoods Advisory Board. Center for Neighborhoods, if you don't know about what that organization is or what it does, is they are all about neighborhood empowerment. So they help neighborhoods understand what it means to become registered, not only with the city, but with the state, because you can get access to funding. If you're an organization that's registered, you can have your nonprofit status. There are things that you can do. At the same time, they also provide training. And that training touches on what's planning. How do you bind it? How do you start, managing your finances if now you're an organization and you're going to collect dues? All of those things that go into organization and also planning. But there are great resources out here in Kansas City to help with that.
But I also think that it's not necessary for the neighborhood association to be the first step. I love it when people are getting together with their neighbors and doing that. But I mean, I'm not involved in my neighborhood association. They're lovely people, but it's too much like work, right? Sometimes being the person who shows up at a meeting to talk about an issue, it can also be extremely powerful. I can tell you my previous job, I was the community development director for the city of North Kansas City. There is a section of our code on accessory dwelling units that's there specifically because there was one person in North Kansas City who cared about that section and read it and had questions and wanted to talk about it. And there's something in there that's because Linda wanted to ask questions and talk about accessory dwelling units, and she seemed like the only person who was super engaged in that. So one person can make a difference in a community. So if you're the one person and you don't have a neighborhood association, or they're not super interested in what you are passionate or what you care about, be the one person who shows up to ask questions and talk about something, and you can make a difference.
That's great. I was just getting ready to say that it was so nice to hear, Jenna and Triveece say that we're not alone. You're not alone. After all, it feels like kind of this last 2 years, I think there's been just this tremendous feeling of isolation and feeling like the weight of the world's problems are on your shoulders. But now I'm thinking about Linda the Lone Wolf, who updated North Kansas City's code all by herself. So maybe we can all channel a little bit of Linda whenever we are feeling fiery about an issue, but rely on our peers when there's something that we don't like, but we think there's other people who probably don't like it too, and we can take support from one another to make things happen. So where I'm kind of bouncing around here a little bit, but I think this question will be really interesting for some people to hear your insights, having some of your varied experience in the community engagement or public involvement, public engagement. People have probably heard it said multiple different ways, but you know, not everyone's as confident as Miss Linda in North Kansas City. You know, the meetings and hearings that people have to show up to, there can be really intimidating and hostile environments, especially depending on who you are. So are there things that any of you have noticed throughout your tenure as planners that you would say you would change the format of how public meetings are facilitated, or how council meetings are facilitated or conducted? What are some of the things that you might change about those so that they would be more accessible to residents to have the confidence to go up there and share their thoughts?
I think it's hard to tackle the idea of confidence. Some of that has to do with what you have working with you as a person. Public speaking is something that scares a lot of people. And often things have to hit the fan, so to speak, to bring people out of the woodwork. And then they just have to throw fear in the backseat and say what they need to say. I think it's hard to tackle that, you know, but I would say this: I think that the overall process that we have from the government standpoint about how public hearings happen has learned a lot, or can benefit from sustained changes that we have learned during the pandemic. And I would step back and say this: we're using Zoom right now. For most of us, we've been using Zoom for 2 years, but Zoom didn't start 2 years ago. It started before that. Other platforms started before that. We just weren't using them because we didn't need to. And some of you may have heard me say something about how long it takes a habit. Habits get solidified for people within a year. It's like 260 some odd days. They start forming the first few months. So we've been at this for a while. I think that has also provided people an opportunity to participate in these meetings because they have something they want to share and say. People who normally wouldn't participate, that you wouldn't see. And I'll give you this specific example. I was doing some work with Mark and Kansas City, Missouri's Housing and Community Development Department. And it was in the fall. Before we made our special presentation to the Housing Committee, there was another session going on. This woman called in on Zoom. I think she was on the sidewalk somewhere outside, and she was giving testimony. That would have never happened because in Kansas City, things happen during business hours. In other cities, and I don't know, Sarah, North Kansas City may be like this, I don't know, but in smaller communities, you tend to have those meetings happening, you know, starting like around 6. Why does that matter? Because people are going to work. They go to work during the day. Most people, in theory, except those of us who are working all times of day and night, most people are off work by 5 o'clock roughly. And if you fight rush hour traffic and do the things you got to do, pick up your kids, etc., you may be able to get somewhere to give your testimony or listen, just listen to what's happening in your community if it starts at 6 or 6:30. And so if I could change anything or make any improvements, it would be to continue having the multiple ways of engaging during those meetings whenever they're scheduled. And I think there should always be that digital component, because you can Zoom in by clicking a link if you have internet access, or you can just do what we were taught years and years ago, is pick up the phone and dial the number and get into the conversation. Then you need to have people who can manage the queue and all that. But that's really important. And then scheduling meetings at a time of day when people can actually participate. When you don't do that, you reduce participation. And I know that there are lots of reasons why people think that's okay. I think I'm advocating to let's just make a shift so that when things are available, they are available at times where you can try to get the most people. So I would add those 2 things.
Yeah, I think from a local government point of view, you know, there's a difference between a public meeting and community engagement. and then the public hearing process. Public hearings can be sometimes the way those are structured is dictated by state statute. Sometimes it's dictated by municipal code and what you have to do, and minimums and notice. And sometimes, cities, even when they could make changes around those, they're hesitant to do so just because maybe they've got a city attorney who kind of frowns on changing it, and you've always got to do it the same way. Sometimes it's just that their governing body is comfortable with a particular format, and it's hard to get them to agree to a change. But public engagement and public meetings just generally, those are often, the format of those is set by planners, and maybe if they're working with a consultant, just having an idea of how to engage people, what's the best time of day and the format, and because the goal is to get people into the process. And those are much more flexible. And the other thing to keep in mind is that it's also, how a community kind of evolves their process of community engagement also partly is made up of people's comments about what they like and what they're willing to leave their house to come to or make time in their schedule for. In North Kansas City, like our typical public meeting was very much set by what we knew people would attend, and times, and comments from people. Oh, I wish you'd had this a little later, or that it had been a little longer. So sometimes you can tell the planner on a topic or for a community, hey, I wish you would do your public meetings like this, and see that rolled into a future public meeting format or process. Planners we are open to suggestion because we want these processes to work for the community. And we're trying to think of ways to engage people in lots of different formats. So, come and talk to us about bike lanes or schools or land uses or grocery stores, but also talk to us about public meetings too, because that's very helpful in figuring out how to do it better.
I totally agree with what both Sarah and Triveece are saying. I think public engagement, especially through the pandemic, has been very difficult, and every single planner in the industry has had to completely rethink public engagement. And there have been so many different platforms and tools and online components added to our engagement toolbox these past couple of years. And I feel like Triveece said, a lot of these things should probably stick around because we're able to use, instead of maybe 2 or 3 different types of engagement platforms or formats, we're able to use 6 or 8 and give people, a whole bunch of different ways online, social media, in person, different in-person formats. I know my firm, we totally don't even do in-person presentations anymore. We do only open house style public meetings to allow people to come in and out as they please and not have a set time really at all for people to have to show up, which has really helped. And just having that diverse array of things for people to give input on and in different ways. So that has really been beneficial.
Yeah, so we have all of these lessons learned. I mean, we're constantly learning. We're constantly seeing, oh, that's really interesting. A lot more people got involved because of this. We should start integrating this more often. But if we go a step back from there, there's members of our communities that no matter what tool or trick or meeting format you are employing, there's a trust issue, and they don't believe that even if they do show up, they'll be listened to, they'll be respected. So how do we go even one step farther from back of addressing, unfortunately, a lot of the distrust that has happened between community members and community planners, because we are at a lot of times the forefront of setting policy and implementing policy, and thus being part of this cycle. So I'd be interested to hear if some of you feel comfortable sharing on how we start addressing the trust issue. So then all of those tools and tricks that we have up our sleeves actually can start to engage genuinely the full spectrum of our community members.
I mean, I will say I don't think that this is unique to planners. And I don't think city planners can solve this problem on their own. This is really a local government issue. And you have to have the support and the backing of the entire local government apparatus to really solve issues of trust and credibility. Because it's not just city planners, it's elected officials and public works departments and city attorneys, and just because we're all, at the end of the day, it's one big organization that's all has to work together to really make a great community. I think planners, at least the planners I know, feel the most responsible for this because we're often trying to get people to think holistically about a community. And so I know a lot of planners who, this is what they dedicate themselves to, right? Is how do we build trust among a community? But I really think that it's an issue that involves so many people beyond just the planning department. So sometimes it's difficult for me to see a way to do that without really bringing every single component of local government to the table, especially our elected officials.
I think some things, I work in the private sector, so I obviously don't work as a city planner necessarily, but anytime we're doing planning work in a community, I think the first thing we have to do for any sort of trust level is to engage and listen at the smallest level we can. So individuals, stakeholders, neighborhood associations, building that trust through a project process or as you're working for the city as a planner. I think just building that person-to-person trust with your community is really important. And I think we can't have a city totally revamp themselves and change what their priorities are overnight. So I think as individuals, as planners, as individuals, that's what we can do to help with the distrust around what we're doing. But planners inherently are people who design and plan for community members. So our work is completely for you guys and the community we're working in. So we're not trying to push our own ideas. We're always trying to push your ideas forward. So
I would take all of that and I would add this other element to it, which is that we know that government is beyond local. Government is at the county level, it's regional, and it's federal. We also know that some of the issues that we have in our communities are because of planners that were decades before the people that you see on this call set up certain things that impacted the zoning. It's why there's segregation in our communities. Planners did that. Other people who thought they knew what they were doing, right? They know best, created that environment for us, right? So we work in that. And that creates a legacy of not listening to people, of disregarding people, of not valuing people and zooming in on different races and ethnicities, income levels, and saying that we don't need to pay attention to you. That happens. And the reason why I picked the government standpoint is that's multi-level, but there's also planning going on in the private sector. Not just because you're a consultant like Jenna and I, but there are developers that have planners on staff. And they go off and do great things. Some of them, maybe they're not doing such great things, but planning is happening at all levels and from different sectors, right? And ultimately what is being planned is in somebody's community. It's in somebody's, maybe their backyard or next to them or down the street. Things are always happening. And so I think it's important to realize that it's from a lot of different people coming from different avenues, and they all have different lived experiences and backgrounds. And that informs how they interact when they meet with community members. And so at that point, you have to figure out what is your perspective as you're doing the work that you're doing. What are you trying to do? Because everyone isn't going to say, oh yeah, I'm here to listen. That's not what it is. We all know that's not what it is. Also, when people have meetings, some people like to have meetings to meet. I don't do that. I think that's a waste of time. My time is valuable, and so is the time of the community members that I'm inviting to come and participate in whatever it is that we're trying to do in this community. And it also begins to think about how did these projects start in the first place? Whose idea was it? Did it come from the neighborhood? Did it come from somebody in government? Did it come from a developer? Is that even what the community wants in the first place? All of that framework informs what that experience is going to be when you go and do an engagement. Because it also begins to speak to who has power in that conversation. And so when we're doing engagement, when we're doing planning, when we're doing design, when you're doing construction, all of those come into play. All of those are factors that have to be considered. I think that the way that that gets tackled again is, what are you trying to do as you do your work? What are your own values? What are you trying to do? As a person of color, it's very important for me that when I'm doing whatever I'm doing, that the community has what I would call their fingers all over everything that we're trying to do. And so I use techniques to make that happen. And I think Brett's on here. I think here, I'm doing a project and it's in an urban part of Kansas City. And so we were doing activities, and basically I asked the community that's participating in this particular project, and really it's a smaller section of the community because it's a committee, it's like a board. And so we're asking them to do the design for what they're thinking about this site could be. And we also asked them, once they've gone through that experience, to have some takeaways. How do they feel about it, et cetera? And one of them said, don't architect it up once you get done. And I love that. I'm going to keep that with me and tell everybody about that, because they recognize that we have a certain skill set. We have planners on our team, they have landscape architects. In some projects, you're going to have engineers, et cetera, and they have a certain skill set that we have been trained to execute. Your values, your practice, your experience is going to determine how you execute that. And so if you go through the process to try to make sure everyone's fingers are on the project and they come up with concepts, they do these things, you don't want to take it back to the office and go, oh no, I know what to do. We need to do this and this and this, and then I'm going to come back and show you my great design. That gets on people's nerves. They don't like that. And then you have lost trust there. They have been devalued. And at this point, you have probably wasted the time that you used before you showed them your great idea. And so you got to have that mindset too, that when you're doing work, you're doing it with the community, and you are not saving them with your work. You're not doing work for them per se. You're not doing work to them. You are collaborating with or coming together. I just watched something the other day, and the woman was talking about diversity and the multicultural aspects of her community. And she was talking about having a thing with spokes, and she put up her hands like this, and she said, there's a set of people, this is another set of people, and we come together like this, and we go and do great work together. That's not the same thing as melding everybody up into one thing and saying, hey, I've got it all, and I'll taste like whatever it tastes like. It doesn't respect and honor the variances in that and the perspectives that make projects richer. And you don't want to lose all of that when you're doing engagement. But in order to do that, as you're doing engagement and planning and design, you have to have that as a value. And if your team doesn't have that when you're doing work, then the experience that the community has is going to be negative at some point. So again, I think there's a lot of personal things that are going on that affect your team, your makeup, your perspective, and then how you communicate that. And it happens not just in government, it's the private sector, the built environment space, it's all over the place. But I think each one of us can make changes in that.
Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. I think that's a great way to end our conversation, is that a planner's goal is to work with the community and to build together, right? Thank you, Tresa, and thank you, Jenna and Sara and Triveece, for joining us today. Thank you, all of you who participated. So all of our audience members today, we are so happy that you got to join us. This has been a really excellent conversation. And like I mentioned before, it's just the start. This has been a really rich conversation. There have been so many great questions and discussion that I think we're probably going to plan another similar event later this year. So keep an eye out, keep in touch, and we'll follow up with more of those details later. Along with those details, I'm going to be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow for those of you who were not able to join live with us today. I'll send out a link to the recording of our panel today. I'm also going to send out some other details. I will be sending out our links that we had in the chat, as well as we've got another event related to planning coming up this weekend. So we've got a few spaces left in our mobile workshop that we'll be doing in Overland Park this weekend. It's going to be a bike ride and a chat with BikeWalkKC staff and also Overland Park city staff about riding bikes in the suburbs and how you can link trails and city streets to get where you need to go. This is going to be Saturday morning this weekend, and space is limited. We wanted to keep it a high quality event where you could actually hear and have conversations, and also big groups on a trail on a nice day are not very friendly to other trail users. So it's a small group. We've still got a few spaces left. I'll send out that link with our email tomorrow. And so if you'd like to join us, you can sign up there. If you have further questions that we didn't get to cover today, like I said, keep in touch, reply to that email I send out tomorrow, and we will try to follow up with those. If not immediately, then in our next planning event. We are a member-supported nonprofit, BikeWalkKC is, and our work is funded by BikeWalkKC members, like many of you are. If you are not yet a member, I invite you to invest in the work that we're doing together. So redefining our streets as places for people to build together that culture of active living. I want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. Thank you again to each of the panelists, and have a good afternoon.